There was a man who would come down to Wayno's every morning in a horse-drawn cart with his wife, and he'd do his shopping, and he'd go home, and he'd pick up his mistress and bring her down in the horse-drawn cart. Anyway, and they'd do their shopping, but that was just fine because they were defined as insiders within the Antrim community, and everybody accepted the arrangement. There was a man in town who was always clean-shaven, and with a kind of Dutch boy haircut. And I discovered much later that he wasn't a man. But if you were defined as a member of the Antrim community, you could exercise all sorts of unconventional behaviors, and that was just fine. Which is a sociological point.
Well, I have a story about unconventional behaviors, my own. There was one of the things that I got started doing, being up there at the lake, with nobody else around, was photographing dragonflies. And so I would wander the lake with a telephoto lens and a large camera. And one time, I don't remember when this was, probably 10 years or more ago, Joan was down at the end of the lake with the road, the north end, and somebody, I don't remember who it was, came up to you and said, "Do you know anything about this strange guy walking around the lake?"
I said no.
So you get observed even on a lake that doesn't seem to have too many people on it.
One thing I don't think has been brought up too much is that some of us, coming up here in our teenage years, had jobs. And we had summer jobs in the area, so we really got to interact with others. I worked for my Uncle Jack for 2 summers, and I played a role in building a number of structures around town and fixing others and moving barn foundations. And I worked for my Uncle Bob also, welding and building the various inventions like the domestic burner and button sorting machines, whatever would come out of his off of his drafting table the night before. It was a great experience for a kid. My wife scooped ice cream in Hillsborough.
Really?
Yeah.
I remember the apple orchard that we came to visit. Every fall, there would be a harvest, and the way this would work is people from town would come, and they each have a number. They pick apples, fill the bushel box with apples, and put their number on it. And my father would drive around with a tractor pulling a flatbed trailer and collect all the bushel boxes and put them in the cooler and pay everybody with the numbers. I was very curious because I remember being there, and I asked my father only a few years ago how this worked, because apples don't really get ripe until after we're in school. And when we were in school, we were in Massachusetts. Well, he clarified. He said we would come up on weekends to do this. And so, some memories of Alabama Farm, which was compared to Northeastern Farm, Alabama Farm was like the carnival. There's beautiful tennis courts there, which, as I understand, were a wedding gift for Dick's mother. And Johnny and I used to play there. It was one of my earliest exposures to wildlife. Wildlife being defined as the cows that would wander around the pasture there. And I particularly remember Dick's, he had a little house that was probably 8 by 8 off in the pasture where he would play the violin. And not too far from where his house currently is. But we had great fun there in Alabama.
Where did the name come from? Alabama Farm, why Alabama?
My grandmother discovered when the farm was just forming up that the word Alabama means here we rest, or rest in peace, something beatific like that.
Nice.
Yep.
Speaking of Professor Winslow's cabin, Dick taught for decades music at Wesleyan and composed a number of operas, and quite a prominent person in his field. But I used to go down and play with Richie Moore, Dick's oldest son, and you knew that when Mr. Winslow was out in his cabin, he was not to be disturbed, because I think you did a whole lot of composing in that cabin.
Information about that cabin, as you call it, it was the ice house
Oh.
behind the Alabama Farm barn. You couldn't see
Oh,
it.
I see.
And part of the winter activity was cutting ice in Red Lake, for example, with a saw, and storing it in such a house covered by sawdust. So it was.
You can read the story of Dick's cabin and the other one that's in the woods back behind the Boy Scout camp, the town camp near our cabin.
Byron W.
Byron W. Coe
Memorial
Memorial Camp. I knew somebody would remember. Joan wrote an article about the two of them. Was it the last limerick or the limerick?
No,
Two books.
2 limericks ago.
Anyway,
March,
it's recently been talked about in the limerick.
Joan.
I just have a funny thing, you know. You're used to seeing people from Antrim in Antrim. When you're a summer person, you see other summer people, you see other townspeople. But for a while, as Frank said, we were stuck living in the Boston area, and I worked at Harvard, and we had 2 kids at that point. So, well, actually, when we had the first kid, I would walk from Harvard University to East Cambridge, where I would run to East Cambridge to pick up our son from daycare, and walk back, giving him time, letting him walk and play. We would just, play along. It gave Frank another hour or 2 at work at the lab. And one day, I passed someone. Do you remember? I saw Martha, and I had no memory. So I had seen Martha Osler a number of times on Greg Lake Road, right? Even though we lived in our own world at the far end and hardly saw anybody, but I had many times just nodded or said hi to Martha Osler. And one time I'm walking between Harvard and East Cambridge, and we passed each other and nodded and said hi. And then, wait a second, this is out of context. This is the wrong place. What are you doing here? So I must have walked right near their house, essentially every day, in their house in Cambridge, while going back and forth to daycare, picking up my kids and bringing them back.
OSHA was not in existence in the 50s in Antrim, and there were innumerable opportunities for agricultural employment for boys and girls. And I actually worked on our farm, and the method of spraying the trees was an interesting one. We had what essentially was a big tank, and water would be put in the tank from the pond that the Hillsborough County Extension had made on my grandfather's farm. Then my father and my uncle would have these bags of stuff that was mixed with the water, And we as kids would sit on top of this water tank while the propeller was spraying. You know, it's lucky that when we had children, they didn't have 3 heads and, but
When I used to tell my kids stories like this, they would shake their head and say, explains a lot.
and then apple picking, 25 cents a bushel for if you picked off the tree. Less of drops, of course, are inferior. You didn't get that much. But we were given ladders and really no instruction about safe use of ladders. And we'd be up there as an 11-year-old picking the Gravensteins and hoping you didn't launch yourself. So this is pre-OSHA. And there were 13, 14 different farms, and a lot of kids would work year-round. Go to Messelbrook's or, you know, the dairy farms, and they'd work full-time. They'd work before they went to school, and then
They delivered milk to the doorstep.
and the kids would also deliver milk. So this was a real agricultural community in the 40s and 50s.
Peter, it's been mentioned that a while back the lake was smaller and lower. We live on the channel going down to the new dam, and I understand, I've snorkeled around there, there's a channel that's cut in that beginning. There was what's we've been heard referred to as the old dam. Does anybody know what was there, what the structure looked like, where the lake started?
Ben Pratt would know.
Well, the old dam is submerged up at the head of the channel, and that was where the original Gregg Mill was. And I assume it was just a water wheel, because,
In that channel. You
Yeah.
can go see the pilings underneath, the wood still remains underneath.
and then back in 1970 was the last time that we ran the lake all the way down as far as we could, and it opened just above the existing dam. There's a couple of areas of stoned up channels.
Right,
And
15
those-
feet tall on either
Yeah.
side, about
Those
15
were
feet
dug,
wide.
I think, by primarily people from Goodell Company in a very dry summer to enable them to get more water out of Gregg Lake than would have flown left to itself.
Right.
Yeah, you remember they turned, I think John Brown was involved in
Yeah.
this, turned off the water to the Great Brook at night.
At night.
Well, to conserve water behind the dam, so
Yeah.
they would have enough on. About 4 in the morning, he would turn it on.
Open a spillway or
Yeah, and
something.
so it would start flowing towards the mills, down and further downstream.
Thank you.
I understand there were many mills on the Great Brook. Right down from the new dam was a sawmill. And then further down Clinton Center there was the Abbott Company, which made children's furniture, was allegedly the largest American maker of children's furniture. These depended on hydropower. Other memories?
Mrs. Kohler or Ann, do you have any?
Sorry?
Do you have any memories?
Oh, I'm just thinking about them all as all of this is going on. Jane and I were looking for a place for my family to use in the summertime. And so it happened we just knew Dot Ellison, who many of you probably knew and remember well. She and I had been stationed in the Army together, and she was one of my instructors when I was in school. And one day we had we came over to see her when we were looking for a cottage. And she said, well, I don't know of anything in this area. Well, about 4 weeks later, we had a phone call. There's a cottage for sale. So this was in March. So Jane came up from her station and I came up from mine. Have you ever stepped into a cottage that's been closed all winter? A summer cottage with no insulation to speak of? And nevertheless, we bought it, right there, from Ernie Brooks,
And when was that? What year?
1967.
Wow.
And we had, one of the things we needed to do, we felt strongly, the cottage was a sort of an ugly yellow color. So we decided we would paint it. Well, we didn't have much time allotted usually because we only had so much leave time. And then we had to go back to work. And so I remember distinctly, and Ben would appreciate this, that Jane and I got up and we were painting like mad to get a certain amount done. And finally we decided we just had it. So we put down the ladder and the paintbrush, and just then Dot Ellison came up the driveway. Where do you want me to start? So things like that, and Jane and I just loved this place. And Denise said, well, Jane used to take everybody up in her airplane and fly around. We'd all go out in the middle of the compound and wave like mad. And
You and she used to fly up from South Carolina?
from Florida.
Florida. And did you keep your plane over in
Well,
Deering?
actually, it was from New Jersey originally.
Did you
Yeah.
keep the plane over in Deering?
Yes, we used to land in this little one strip over here, and Dot Ellison would pick us up and take us to the cottage, and we had a car that stayed there over the winter. And then in the fall, she'd take us back to the airplane, and we'd dust off the frost and ice and take off.
Are you talking about the landing
And
strip?
it
Oh,
was
sorry.
just wonderful. I have many memories of the whole place, of Murdy Brooks and all the other people that I knew
Yeah.
in the town. It's just flowing by me right now.
Mr. Winslow had a question.
Yeah, my question was, what landing strip?
I'm sorry, I can't.
What landing
landing
The
strip?
hawthorn feather that you're talking
Yes,
about?
yes.
What is Deering?
Deering.
Yeah.
Referring to that one?
And watching all of Chris's kids grow up.
All
We
seven.
had great fun watching them and sometimes harassing them. And the parents were there while Jane and I took over.
So the Kohlers had 7 children, and the Nevillers had 6 children. And we're all alive and well with our own children and their children. So there's many years of major friendship because of Greg Lake.
We bought the brown cottage because nobody else wanted it. And
For sale
so
in
we
March.
bought that. Over a period of about 3 years, we, with some help, had that built differently on the outside, so you didn't have to crawl in dead on your knees in the corners of the roof. And then Ellie and Charlie Neville rented it from us for a couple of summers, and then they decided they wanted to buy it, so they did.
And who was the fellow that helped you with the roof?
Oh, Russ
Cuddy.
Russ
Rusty
Cuddy
Cuddy.
had a great,
Follow it?
yeah. He had,
Follow the roof?
yeah.
Gabriel roof.
Oh, the Gabriel roof. We had built that year.
It had a very low-pitched roof, and I actually have a picture of the cottage way back when. It's got a very old vehicle next to it and some men standing in the doorway, but the picture is a very poor quality picture. But it was, my mother stayed there with us once, but the upstairs was very low pitch, and there wasn't a lot of room for anything up under that pitch. And it was set up rather strange as to where the bathroom was.
It had a very strange plan inside, but we took care of that over a period of 3 years.
We've been told it came across the lake on the ice.
Yeah.
That's
Chris's came,
That's
Chris cottage came across.
Chris's came across
Okay.
the ice.
And that's,
Not the brown one.
Yeah.
and,
Okay.
and that's not the only cabin that came across the ice. Murray Johnson's, the Johnson place has kind of gotten deteriorated in recent years. But that, in the 1920s, that probably would have been Hiram Johnson, who was Murray and Carol's father, brought his cabin across the ice from where Camp Sachem was. The reason that Greg Lake is Greg Lake and not Greg Pond is because of summer people. There was a guy named Thayer who in 1910 came up with the idea of developing White Birch Point. And he was worried about consumer reaction to offering cabins on the side of a pond. Who wants to live next to a lily pond or a mill pond, you know, low class? And so he came to the town and asked for the change of name. Well, that did not go uncontested. There was a guy named Jameson, and I've forgotten his first name, and maybe no one remembers it. He was developing the north side of the lake, and among his properties was the Peterwall, which was a boarding house. Anyway, Mr. Jameson says it hasn't affected my business at all. It's always been Great Pond, let's leave it Great Pond. The problem with Mr. Jameson is he was very, very assertive and kind of a pain. And on the basis of personality, the town rejected Mr. Jameson's opposition, and Greg Lake, I think in something like 1912 or 1913, became Greg Lake. But you can still see maps that say Greg Pond rather than Greg Lake. Maybe one more comment, and then we'll go.
I have a question. I only lived in town for 24 years, so I'm a pup. I know nothing about it. But I was recently reading a biography on Mary McGrory, and I was fascinated by her stories of Antrim, and then being in a limo in Washington, D.C. with John F. Kennedy, almost within the same paragraph. Anybody have any experience with Mary while she was around the lake?
Yeah. Actually.
Here we go.
Mary was always looking for a cabin to rent, and so one year she asked if she could rent our cabin. Little did we know, the next time she wrote an article, she talked about cabins with fireplaces that don't work. But
This is in the Washington Post, syndicated throughout the country.
The other thing that Mary did, and you get this from her autobiography, is she was one of the best organizers you could ever meet. She sat and she'd say, now Sue, you're going to do this, Stephen, you'll do that. You know, she went around the room. So she would come, and she always wanted to have a picnic or a barbecue or whatever at White Birch Point Beach. So we'd be sitting, all of us would be sitting down there, and she'd say, let's have a picnic tonight. And she'd say, Marcia, you can bring the watermelon, Stephen, you can bring down the ice, and so you can bring it. And I always thought this was so funny, and we'd all do it. I mean, we all did it, and we'd have a wonderful time. And probably my fondest memory of her is one night we stayed down there through the sunset, and it happened to be a spectacularly beautiful sunset. And she sat there and she said, if this is not heaven, what is? I mean, look at this. You know, it's just absolutely wonderful. And then I read her autobiography, and I realized when she would have a party, Ted Kennedy would be her bartender.
Yeah, she would do the same thing in Washington, a sign. And she said it in a way that she just said, yes, I'll do that.
And when you got to the bottom of the list, her name was there, but all the items were checked.
She was
checked
more
off.
the supervisor.
It was fun. It was fun. I enjoyed meeting her. Oh, she said that's right.
David?
She used to stay at the
Just in terms
neighborhoods.
just in terms of interactions with the town, so we got here in 82, and shortly thereafter, we had our third child somewhere in 86, but so we had 3 kids, and I would have done anything to get out of the house. So I used to hang out at Edmonds, and it was a marvel to me. I loved that store. That was my home base, other than the house we lived in. And you know, when he had his fire, so that was it. I mean, I just remember that store, walking around that store, the smell of that hardware store, and they still do have everything that you would ever need to do anything project that you were ever told you had to do. So for me, that was my interaction with the town. Wayno's was Wayno's, but I didn't hang out in that. So we had division of labor, but for me, I just somehow hung out at Edmonds. You know, coming from, someone said Boston was not so great, but so there were big box stores and hardware stores.
Yeah.
Somerville Lumber, for people who might know, that was, huge, it was like predated Lowe's, that kind of thing. But Edmonds was just the place I wanted to be. And our house is green. They have every green iteration of the green paint that we have used since 1982. So
I'll just finish off with this contemporary story. I broke a lamp which my brother Peter made, a beautiful stained glass lamp. And because of clumsiness, and I wanted to do the vacuuming real quick. Marcia was not pleased with this event.
I didn't even hear about it.
Well, Marcia, okay, so I brought the pieces down to Edmonds and gave it to Ted. I thought this sucker is gone because it's got all of these intricate pieces. And I give it to Ted, and a couple of days later he calls me up and says it's ready. So I go down there, and I asked him how long it took to fix this thing, and it was 4 hours. And I said, how much do I owe you? He said $24. I said, that's illegal. That's below the minimum wage. Because 4 hours at $7.25 an hour is 28. But that's endless fixing of my log splitter. Earl, the nuclear engineer, you go in, and Earl, he was an engineer on a nuclear submarine. You go in there and he fixes my log splitter. So it's a very important place. Thank you for coming.
And if I can just say one thing, we have some really people who have a lot of education around this little lake, who have written books and whatnot. But we now have a gold winner at the Olympics.
Oh, yeah. Did you know that?
Yeah, we saw it on.
Yeah, Linda and Ken Gobo's daughter Tessa won a gold in the women's rowing 8. And so we're waiting for them to return to the lake. But I mean, for such a small place.
You know where Lakeview is with the Zacchus cabin? It's the one closer to town on the same side. So I don't know how they did this. If I had a child who was about to win going to the Olympics, every conversation I engaged in would start out like, hey, watching the Olympics? You know, my son, they said nothing. So yeah, anyway, we have a lot to say. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.